As a therapist, how do you feel about anger being in the therapy room? Let's talk about it. Hello and welcome to Therapy Business School. My name is James Taylor. I'm an online counsellor, hypnotherapist, life coach. I'm also a hypnotherapy supervisor. I'm an author, a podcaster, and a YouTuber. So let's talk about anger in the therapy room, and you as the therapist, how you may be on the receiving end of it. What do you think about it? Do you think it's okay? Well, let me just go right back to basics. There's a therapist that I know, and one of their conditions is that anger is not allowed in the therapy room. What do you think about that? Do you think that's okay? Do you think that's a bit of a no-no? Personally, I think it's a bit of a no-no, because coming out with a statement like that to a potential client is putting a condition on a client I would suggest that is unrealistic. And I'll mean it like this. Have you ever spoken about something that happened a long time ago and you're telling someone else about it? And you're talking about this thing that happened maybe decades ago, and you start to feel some of the emotions now that you were feeling back then. You ever experienced that? I know I have. So in therapy, if we're talking with a client and the client's talking with us and they're talking about things that have happened to them, and that's the reason that they're in therapy in the first place, to deny them an emotion, I think is a step too far. That's my own personal stance on this. So I don't agree with what this sort of therapist does. But that doesn't mean that anger is unboundaried in the therapy room. And this applies whether you're working online or in person. So in this lesson, I want to talk about some strategies for having anger in place in the therapy room, some techniques that you can assist clients with or educate clients with that'll help themselves, and some experience that I've had myself. So this is going to be a bit of a fully packed episode. I'm also going to be putting some links in the description below for you to check out. Now, before we get into all that, a bit of a shout out. I've just started a new Facebook group, also called Therapy Business School, and the link for that will be in the description. All you have to do is either be a therapist or be a student therapist, I should say, and answer the qualifying questions to get in the group. And it's going to be a private place for like-minded individuals and more access to me so I can help and this kind of thing. So the link for that will be in the description. Now, let's say you're talking with a client and the client is getting wound up about something. How do you deal with this? Well, what I'd suggest is, on the very first session, and maybe as a reminder as the sessions go on, to explain to the client, when we're in therapy, lots of emotions might come up. There might be sadness, there might be laughter, there might be frustration, there might be anger. Now, all those things are okay in this place, as long as they're appropriate and measured. Now, you might decide not to include that last bit on the end because you're putting a condition on. But the reason I'm phrasing it like that is the client knows that if they get angry, it's okay. It's okay to get angry in this place. But that doesn't mean you start throwing things around and start kicking off, which I would say is very, very unlikely. But you're giving the client autonomy. You're saying, outside you may keep a lid on things, but in here, we can talk. And how you're feeling, we can acknowledge. All right? So that's how I'll probably lead it. And you lead from the front because you're the therapist, you're the expert. You're the person the client is coming to see to get help from and with and to. All right? So you've got to lead a little bit on this, I would suggest. Now, let's say a client is talking about something and they're getting really, really wound up. Now, anyone who's watched enough of these videos has probably heard me say this before. I like elephants. I love elephants. I just don't want one in the room with me. All right? So if a client is getting wound up and I'm thinking, let me deal with this in stages because this is the spread on this is quite wide. Let's say a client is getting wound up talking about something. Name it. Name the fact that you can observe and you can notice they're getting wound up by this. And that can be as simple as saying, I can see that really winds you up. Just acknowledge what's going on for them. Or I can hear it in your voice. I can tell this is bothering you. That kind of comment really does build bridges and rapport with the client. Because outside of the therapy room, they may not feel heard by anybody at all. And they come and see you, and here's you listening to every single word they say, and then noticing things and acknowledging it. How wonderful that must be for a client to experience. I'm being acknowledged, and I'm being heard, and I'm being understood. They may not have that anywhere else in their life. So that's something to consider doing. If there's an elephant in the room, name it. All right. So that's one of the tips I give on this one. Let's say the client is getting angry, and whilst they say it to you, it sounds quite aggressive at you. What about that situation? It's an elephant in the room, maybe for you. So name it. So a way I may phrase that is, I notice when you say that, I can feel the anger at me. I feel from this side of the fence, I can feel as if you've got some anger towards me when you talk about this. Now that can be quite a powerful statement to make, because you're not blaming and you're not finger pointing, you're not accusing. You're talking about what they're doing, how it feels to you. Now this is important because this may resonate in other areas of that client's life. They may be in relationships, and as they talk about things, their anger is projected onto the other person. So they start to experience the anger as well, almost as if they're the person, they're the cause of the anger, when they might not be. So when you bring something like this up with a client, it may help the client realise, actually, you're a trained professional and you're feeling as if I'm angry at you, and I'm not. I am angry, but I'm not angry at you. I'm angry at this other stuff from my past. So that can be quite powerful as well. Another thing to consider is a client may be very, very judgmental of themselves for not dealing with the situation. So instead of the anger being projected at someone else, the anger can be projected at themselves. And listen out for this one, because this can be quite common, where a client can be angry at themselves for not dealing with a situation that happened some time ago, sometimes decades ago, and they're angry at that younger version. Well, it can be quite important, I would suggest, to point out to a client, did that younger version have all the tools that you've got now? Or were they just doing the best they could with what they had? And just go quiet. Let them just think about that for a second. Did that younger version of themselves have these tools? Probably not. Was that younger version doing the best they could with the limited tools they had? They probably were. So really, instead of an anger being projected at that younger version, should it be being congratulated for doing the best they could with what they had in that situation? Question for the client to maybe ponder on, perhaps. Now, a way around this is, and this is not to be done in the therapy session, but a thing that can be incredibly powerful and useful is to get the client to be in their present selves, to write a letter to their younger selves. Right? I'll say that again. So the client in their own time writes a letter to their younger selves. And that can be something along the lines of, for years I've been criticising you. And for years I despised you for not being able to, have a spine and have the courage and do this and do that. And I've criticised you for God knows how long. But really, I know you didn't have the tools then. I know you were just doing the best you could. And I know that if you would have had the tools back then, you would have made different decisions. but you didn't have the tools. So I'm proud of you. I'm proud of you for coping with the limited tools that you had. This can be incredibly powerful for a client to acknowledge that about a younger version of themselves. Now, there's a few things a client can do when this letter is completed. They can either share it with you in the therapy session. They might want to keep it very private to themselves, and whichever they choose is perfectly fine. They might want to keep the letter, or what can be quite useful is you get the client to burn the letter. And the burning of the letter can be very symbolic, because as the letter turns into fire and then smoke and then ash, it can be very symbolic, like a transition of the letting go. Now, when I think of the letting go, I used to volunteer for a charity in Kent called Holding On, Letting Go. And it was a wonderful charity. And it helps children from 7 to 17 who've suffered a bereavement in their life, whether it was natural or unnatural. And it helps them deal with the bereavement issue. It's why it's called Holding On, Letting Go. Holding on to the good stuff, letting go of the sadness. It's a wonderful charity. I'll put the link for it in the description below. Now, when they're working with the children, one of the exercises that they do, which I think all the exercises are fantastic, to be honest, but this one is relevant to this perhaps. What they do is they get the child to write a letter about to the person who's died. Now, sometimes it can be a mother, a father, grandparents, aunts, uncles, brothers, sisters, whatever it might be. Now, for a child, it can be very conflicting because they can feel angry at the person who's died. They love them, but they're angry that they've died and left them. See the conflict in a young child's life, and they don't have the tools to be able to deal with them kind of strong emotions, that love and hate, love and anger, this kind of thing. So one of the exercises that they do with Holding On, Letting Go is they get the child to write out all their angry feelings on a letter. Really empty the tank by writing out all these empty feelings, all these angry feelings, you should say. And then they take the letter outside and they sellotape it to some tarpaulin that's on the floor. They give the child a big lump of wet clay and they say to the child, destroy the letter with the clay. And some of the children really get into this and they're hurling this clay ball, pick it up, hurling it at the paper, and the paper starts to shred and rip. Sometimes there's tears as the child lets go of those angry feelings that they're feeling inside. When that's done, the child is given a new ball of clay. And the exercise on this part is make something that represents the love that you feel for the person who died. And the creativity with some of the kids, it's fantastic what they come up with. You know, there's mugs and there's ashtrays and there's ornaments, and it's wonderful. And then they put to one side and they dry. So when the child, when this is finished, the clay is now dry, and the child can take it home and paint it in their own time. So it's a wonderful way of this letting go. You know, this holding on and letting go. Wonderful. Another thing you can do is encourage your client to do box breathing. Now, box breathing, it was invented by a guy called Mark Miller, and I always get mixed up whether it was the Australian Special Forces or the American Special Forces. I always forget. But what he did was he had to come up with a breathing technique for soldiers in combat in the most stressful of situations. And he came up with box breathing. So just like a box, it has 4 sides. Now the way it works is just like 4 sides of a box. On one side you breathe in, on the other side you hold, on the third side you exhale fully, and on the fourth side you have space and emptiness. And the pace is like 1, 2, 3, 4. That'd be one side of the box. So that inhale would last for that amount of time. Then you hold it for the same count. Then you exhale for the same count. And in the fourth side, you just become aware of that emptiness and that space. Box breathing, fantastic technique. Now, again, this is more dealing with the weed, not the root. Okay? Now, this is still beneficial, But in therapy, I always suggest it's better if we can go for the roots rather than the weeds. Get rid of the roots. There are no weeds. Okay, so box breathing, fantastic technique. Now, your client may not want to be playing with clay, but again, these are just methods and techniques that might work. Writing a letter to them younger selves and then burning it symbolically. Praising their younger selves, and that can be very symbolic as well. Now, in the description below, I'm going to put a link to a video of Carl Rogers. Carl Rogers is dealing with a young client in this video clip, and the young client is a young adult male, and he's had leukemia and he's now in remission. And he's dealing with his feelings around this and anger features. And it really is a masterclass by Carl Rogers, how he navigates the waters of this client. Because this client is saying one thing, their voice is saying one thing, but clearly there's something else going on inside, and their voice is trying to water down, I would suggest, what they're really feeling. And Carl Rogers is gently trying to coax this information out of them. I won't do a full spoiler because it's powerful to watch in its own right. There's one little bit where the client is talking about how they, as Carl Rogers is encouraging them talking about the feelings, this feelings of anger, the client talks about how they're feeling warm inside, but not like in a nice cozy kind of warm, like an anger kind of warm. And Carl Rogers is feeling warm on the inside and the outside. The client acknowledges it. And then as Carl Rogers is probing a bit more and trying to get a bit more information from the client picks up a glass of water, takes a long drink, and acknowledges that he's using the water as a defense mechanism because he's feeling uncomfortable talking about his feelings in this way. So I won't do a spoiler about the whole session. The link will be in the description below, and I'd encourage you to check this out. Now, another thing to consider, and this goes back to maybe in the very first session, or maybe even in a consultation with a client. And this is, I talk in stories and metaphors. I do it to explain myself a little bit better. So feel free to steal this one if this resonates with yourself. Now, what I will often say to either potential clients or clients on a first session, I normally do this and maybe it's about a 50-50 split, to be honest, but I'll use an analogy of a splinter in your hand. And the way I'll say it is, have you ever had a splinter in your hand? And most people have. And I'll say, if you're lucky enough, the end of the splinter is sticking out. So maybe you can get some tweezers or your nailing and pull this thing out. But sometimes splinters can go in quite deep and the end is not sticking out. Now you've got a few choices to make. One of them, which I'll probably say is a non-choice, is to do nothing, to leave the splinter in there. And then the hand will start to ache, it'll throb, it might get infected, it might get worse. So leaving the splinter in is a bit of a non-option, I would suggest. But if we need to get the splinter out, we haven't got anything to grab hold of yet. So what we might have to do is break the skin. And we might have to make where the splinter's gone in, we might have to make the hole a little bit bigger so we can get the end of the thing. Now when we get the end of the splinter, that's going to be painful, picking around the skin to try and get to the end of the splinter. That's going to be painful. And when we get hold of the splinter, it might hurt to take it out. And it might hurt afterwards. But when the splinter's gone, the hand will start to heal. And therapy can be a little bit like this. And I will phrase it that way. Because what I'm really saying is, this may be difficult. This may be painful. This may upset you. This may anger you. This may cause tears. But when we get it out, you're going to start to heal. And this is the natural way I speak. But I found that people can connect with that kind of language. I get the analogy. James is not telling me this is going to be an easy ride. It might be rocky. And the beauty of saying something like this before you even start any work together is that if that rockiness turns up, it's not a total surprise to the client. Of course they know it's not going to be easy, but because you've named the elephant in the room, you know what I'm like with elephants, but because you've named the elephant in the room, it's almost like, well, James told me about this, he warned me this may happen, and I trust him a bit more perhaps because he just said something that might happen and now it's happened. See how this can build a bridge and build that therapeutic alliance between you and the client just by naming an elephant. So, a few takeaways from this video. One is think about naming elephants, either before the therapy starts or during it. Think about acknowledging if there's anger in the room within the client themselves, or if you're feeling the effects of the anger as if it's aimed at you. Think about the client writing a letter to a younger version of themselves. I found that incredibly powerful, I've got to be honest. But explore it beforehand fully, and then maybe give the client a homework to write the letter to their younger selves. It's not done in the session. If the client wants to share it, great. If they don't want to, that's fine too. But then let them do something with the letter. Do they keep it? Do they burn it? What do they do? Something symbolic is quite nice. You've also got the clay aspect as well. Adults may not like this, but if you're working with children, it's fantastic. Fantastic thing to do with children. And depending on where your location is, where you're working, maybe it's something you can do with the child. Who knows? If you're in placement and you're working at the placement where the children are, could you have a word with the people who run the placement and say, I'd like to do this, what do you think? Don't ask, don't get. So think about that. Think about, I'm trying to remember what I've said. So think about using a splinter analogy if you're talking to clients. That can be quite useful. There's also box breathing by Mark Miller. Again, very, very good. That deals with the weeds, not the roots. But that can go hand in hand with your strategy that you're trying to help them with to deal with the roots. And in the description below, there'll be a link to a Carl Rogers masterclass. In that video, by the way, while I think about it, instead of just showing a session, after the therapy session has taken place, he's interviewed and he gives his thoughts on what was going on for him while the therapy session was taking place, which is quite useful because instead of just seeing a skills session or him in action, to hear what he was thinking about when the client said certain things and different directions he wanted to go in, quite powerful, really educational as well. The people who made that video, at the end, they do some like mock scenarios themselves. Make what you will of those. There's some skill sessions where this is what we wouldn't say to a client and this is what we would say, but I think it was made around the 80s, so there's lots of big hair and colourful jumpers and this kind of stuff, and that's at the very end of the video clip. And the last one is if you'd like to join my new Facebook group, the link will be in the description. So long video from me for this one, and this is only the tip of the iceberg of dealing with anger in a therapy room. If you like this kind of stuff, please remember to do the like, the share and the subscribe and ring the bell. That tells YouTube that you like this kind of content. It also helps you be notified every time I make a new episode, which is weekly, and it also shares the love. And if you know anyone who this video may benefit, share it with them as well. Alright, so I'll see you on in the next episode, and this is James from Therapy Business School. Bye bye.